Wow, what an amazing honor. I have to say, so I was just telling Jeffrey I was here a few years ago, and one of the things that really struck me about this society was how warm it is. Just how interested people are in one another's work and the way they do their work, and that people are genuinely happy to see one another and happy to meet new people. And then this keynote, that was, well, the two keynotes, that was the other thing that really struck me about the society, was that unlike like APSA, for, everybody goes. And you're in New Orleans on a Saturday night, and yet here you are. No hurricane cups in sight, although I think that would have been all right. But and then to get this invitation, it was just incredible. And so I just want to say thank you to Jeffrey. Where's Ryan? To Ryan Muldoon, who I think you extended the invitation to me. Thank you. And to Corey, who has left the room, but who was just like amazing and patient with me in every single way and made this just a terrific experience. Okay, it's Saturday night, but I am who I am. So I think that we need to talk about federalism. And I'm serious. And I think, unlike an ordinary talk where I would just stand here, I have no slides too, which really makes, I'm sure that my creds as a political economist has just gone out the window for not having PowerPoint. But I actually want to start not with me talking, but with you talking. And to one another, not to me. And so this is what I want you to think about and then talk with one another about. When you think about federalism in the United States, what three words or phrases come to mind? So take a second to think about that. But like, what are your straight off federalism, US, what? And now just turn to two or three people around you and share what came to mind, and then take a moment to hear from them, to listen to what came to mind for them. I'm absolutely thrilled because apparently you had a lot to say. And maybe we should just take turns coming up to the mic. But rather than, so if you or someone in your group said the word decentralization, raise your hand. Okay. What about states' rights? Okay. Well, I said phrase, right? How about inefficient? Okay. How about anti-democratic train wreck? Something similar? Okay. What were some other things people said? I'm just totally curious. If you want to shout a couple things out.
Experimental.
Racial domination.
Yeah. Well, that's just in with the anti-democratic train wreck, I think, very, very much so. Slavery. Yeah.
Assertion of power.
Yeah.
Power sharing.
Power sharing. Okay, great. All right. So I hear those kinds of things all the time when I say that I work on federalism, and in particular that it's an anti-democratic train wreck. Although the decentralization, states' rights, and then from there we get into racism and white supremacy very quickly, and that it's just generally inefficient. I hear it all the time. And so, and I read it all the time, including in very recent work, in excellent work, that federalism is either a tragic compromise, to borrow Rubin and Feely's phrase, undermining a functional political system, or it's assumed to mean something that is heavily bottom-weighted, or, and most often these days, it's a source of despair. People are really frustrated with federalism. So we tend to think of federalism as something that's layered on top of our democratic system, right? And it's distorting it. It's distorting it in terms of allocation of resources. And in this kind of conventional or standard view of federalism for allocation, we think of, well, there's state autonomy to satisfy diverse preferences. Then we centralize to overcome externalities. And in this sense, diversity, which is a word I'll use a lot to bring back up what Jeffrey was talking about, diversity is inconvenient, right? The only reason why we decentralize is because of the inconvenience of people wanting different things. And what I want to offer is a different kind of frame for thinking about what federalism does. So first, rather than being an obstacle or kind of like the really gross frosting on top of the democracy cupcake, it's federalism's filled with bakery analogies. So it's completely intertwined with democracy in the United States. And that rather than thinking of federalism as a method of allocation, I want to encourage you to think about it as a method of problem solving, of social problem solving. And so in this alternative, we'll think about state differences in terms of the problems that they have, in terms of the expertise that's available to them, and in terms of their perspectives. We can centralize then to take advantage of learning. And that then, in this sense, diversity is an asset. It's an asset in our political system. Okay? And you might call this the Brandeis view for states as policy laboratories. And although I don't think that the metaphor fits all that well, because it's not really what states are doing, they aren't directed by any scientist. They often have their own objectives, and they often experiment in rebellious ways, as well as very subtle ones. When states are charged with implementation of federal policy, they can tweak things around the edges to better fit their own preferences through exercising the discretion of implementation. But so lest you think I'm about to spend 30 minutes in praise of federalism, let me just get to my bottom line, which is federalism is more than a tool for democracy, it's an engine. It's part of democracy's operating system. I'm totally mixing my metaphors here. It's how it solves problems in very real ways. In the United States, federalism is democracy's vehicle. And we don't understand how to drive it. And here we sit right before the midterms. I worry that we're about to crash the car. Okay, so the topic. What is problem solving? We can get off of that very heavy thing that I just said and move into science, which is a lot heavier. So what is problem solving? So I encourage you to set aside those normative frames that we brainstormed in the beginning, and also our empirical observations about the chaos that federalism seems to create. And think about what it would mean for federalism to be a problem-solving mechanism. So remember that allocative theory of federalism with this distribution of resources, it also implies that interests are the same as policy preferences. So it doesn't help us think about where policy comes from. And it actually presumes that policy exists or is easily found. And it ignores the complexity of many of our policy problems. So with federalism for problem solving, first I want to think about a definition of learning. Like, what would learning look like in a system like this? So Herb Simon defines learning this way. Learning is any change in a system that produces a more or less permanent change in its capacity for adapting to its environment. Okay, so already we're thinking about a system, our political system, our federal system, and how we might learn is a way that helps us to better respond to our environment, and our environment is probably changing, right? Our environment is dynamic, and so this is something that we can never rest with. We are always needing to make some adjustments. And so then taking that, then Simon offers us this definition of problem solving, several parts. Okay, the first step in problem solving is to identify the problem. What is it that we need to solve? So that also we can break into two pieces: identification or recognition of a problem, and then framing that problem. That is perspective taking on that problem. Then, second, we need to identify, so here's our problem, what would better look like? Okay. And then, if we can go from problem and then imagine what is better, then we need to develop some courses of action that can get us from here to there. Okay? So identification of possible courses of action. Then as we come up with ideas of how to transition, we need to select among our alternatives. So selection of the remedy. And then finally, we implement the solutions. So all of this is part of what happens when we engage in problem solving. And then there's another person I want to lean on, my former, now deceased colleague at Santa Fe Institute, Murray Gelmont. So he says, for problem complexity, rather than thinking, given what we've just thought about with Simon, all those steps, rather than a singular genius imposing some kind of top-down design, let the form of the solution emerge as a product of bottom-up, adaptive, and evolutionary processes. Okay. Key to this is harnessing diversity. So with an evolutionary process in biological systems, we think about, well, we have a couple of components. So there's differentiation or mutation, right? And then from that selection based on environmental fit, and then some process of reproduction, right? So mutation, selection, reproduction, we think of as kind of an evolutionary process. Well, we can take that and find parallels to the policy space. So there's a search for policy alternatives, that's that mutation part. We can choose something that is better, that's the selection part, and then diffuse that policy if it wasn't initially adopted globally. And that should all happen based on a fit for the problem landscape. But again, remember, problem landscape, it's dynamic, but then also it's probably not global, right? So there's a lot of local contexts that we want to be sensitive to. And so returning to Simon's language, in that search for policy alternatives is, in Simon, the search is what to solve, so defining the problem, which includes that identification, includes the framing. It's what better looks like, or the goal setting, and it's how to solve, what are the alternatives. And then the policy choice, that final element, or in the implementation, comes after. And we can also consider the sticking points that make these policy problems hard to solve. Capital is imagination, sufficient imagination or inspiration, having an idea for how to move from here to there. There's also, of course, will. There's this cost-benefit analysis that we do, and it could be that the cost of innovating outweighs what you project to be possible benefits. And those perceived benefits that's especially likely to lose out in that calculus the more uncertainty there is in that environment. And so with risk aversion, you're just not going to try, even if you could think of something. And so we very quickly see that the search process, this generation of new ideas, has many more difficulties than other parts of problem solving. So we would want to, if in policy generation, we want to do all we can to ameliorate the search process. And if only one government is searching, that problem solving is a lot harder to pull off. So the key point from this is that you need diversity to solve these problems well. You need diversity of approach, certainly, in the states as policy laboratories way, but it's a lot more extensive, including a diversity of what's better, because how do you know what's better until you try? In policymaking, that overcoming that risk aversion is really hard. But being able to observe what others have tried, and now I guess I do sound a lot like Brandeis, so I'm just gonna go all in and embrace it for a moment. So here's from his New State Ice Company dissent. It's one of the happy incidents of the federal system that a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments. Who said experiments? Someone over here. Without risk to the rest of the country. Okay, he's never heard of externalities, but we'll leave it there for a moment. States have been heavily engaged in US policymaking for a long time. And so I just want to walk you through some of the things that they've done domestically. So state and local administrations, not the federal government, set most of the policies that affect day-to-day lives of their residents, including policies related to policing, education, land use, criminal justice, emergency response, and public health. States have far more control over education policy, providing over 90% of funding for schools in almost every state. Moreover, the federal government depends on states to implement nearly all major federal policies, including the most costly, health insurance and welfare. As states implement federal policy, as I said before, they exercise discretion. And so they adjust it around the margins. There's fantastic data on the variation from state to state in Clean Water Act enforcement. One law, many, many, many outcomes. And thanks to their sizable economies, the largest states can make decisions that have an impact beyond their own borders. And so all of this means that policymaking in the United States is not some kind of top-down exercise, but it is a system. And that system means that it's far more adaptable and the states are far more powerful than has generally been recognized. And so particularly striking is the extent to which the states, as we've been alluding, can be centers of policy innovation. So they have distinct economies, which, although they vary greatly in size, even the largest and most diverse states have populations whose interests and attitudes are more cohesive than those of the country at large. States also tend to be better, and for that reason, at assembling big coalitions to support major policy action. And they don't have the kind of procedural hindrances that the federal government has, the filibuster, the absence of the line item veto. And that really constrains the federal government. So as a result, these states have long been drivers of progress and change. So as early as the 19th century, for example, Iowa, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania lifted bans on interracial marriage, even as other states opposed them. Over time, however, states with bans repealed them as public support for interracial marriage grew. It was very much a slow process that was percolating across the states, right? And as in 1967, we think of the Loving v. Virginia decision from the Supreme Court as being the key moment, but that ignores the 100 years of process that happened before that was happening within the states. And so really, many of the most important federal policy changes, including ending slavery, expanding marriage rights, voting rights, civil rights, changing healthcare access, reproductive rights, welfare coverage, reforming public education, protecting the environment, these were tried first at the state level and bubbled up to the national level. States do more than test new policy. They also fill in existing policy gaps when the federal government stalls. So think about immigration. Despite an economy like ours that relies so heavily on immigrant workforce, the United States often, and we're in a really fraught time, the United States often leaves those seeking permanent status in legal limbo for years. As a result, states have filled the policy gap, with blue states like California and New York offering access to healthcare and education for the undocumented, and red states like Arizona and Texas using their own resources to increase border enforcement and internal controls. Similarly, when the federal government failed to impose a strict national standard on auto emissions, California created its own with the federal, getting a blessing from the federal government. And because of the size of its market, was able to force automakers to manufacture cars nationwide to meet California's standards. Well, I'm gonna skip this next one because it's working its way through the courts. Over the past 2 decades, states have also gained leverage to experiment in areas like legalizing marijuana, despite conflicting federal law. I was just looking at the midterms, and it's like the Dakotas and Arkansas, sort of catching up with the rest of the country on marijuana legalization. That's on the ballot this Tuesday. But they legalized marijuana despite the continued existence of conflicting federal law. States are taking advantage of a federal government that has pulled back on marijuana-related enforcement, unrelated to organized crime, but still hasn't repealed the criminal penalties. And with the federal action on climate change increasingly impeded, including somewhat paradoxically from the states themselves, right? Because it's not like the states are all, that's the point, they're not of one voice, remember diversity. So I'm thinking about West Virginia v. EPA, but many other kinds of challenges. States have new opportunities to fill the breach. Already, many states are decarbonizing their energy sources. 21 states have set 100% clean energy goals. Some are enacting zoning rules that ban gas hookups in new buildings and are prohibiting new industry on the basis of greenhouse gas emissions. New York State denied the construction permits to a cryptocurrency mining operation on the grounds that it was at odds with the state's sustainability goals. So in this dance of adaptation and response between Washington and the states, the federal system builds in enough flexibility for the US policymakers to innovate and take on major issues facing the country, even when the federal government is hobbled by polarization, legislative gridlock, and court-imposed limits, especially now with the shutdown of, apparent shutdown of agency rulemaking. So a lot going on the domestic side. But I want to turn to the foreign policy side. So, because despite their growing role in setting domestic policy, states may seem to have little sway in foreign affairs. Because nation-to-nation diplomacy and hard power, you might think, reigns supreme. But this is have to confess, very new work for me, thinking along these lines, but I'm very excited about it. So in many regions of the world, and a whole host of issues like aviation, ocean management, climate change, refugee resettlement, these traditional tools compete with other forms of influence. So Anne-Marie Slaughter, president of New America, has argued that we've moved to a new global regime of networks. And these networks of institutions and individuals, scholars and scientists, government officials, business executives, the leaders of social movements, they have been sharing ideas and coordinating activities across borders. And this is incredible, it can be incredibly forceful. So international networks that include the states have become a critical way for the country to assert its leadership on many issues. So when bolstered by state governments' power to develop policy experiments and set national standards, such cross-border exchanges can drive policy innovations, including in areas like artificial intelligence, biomedicine, blockchain, renewable energy, that are becoming more difficult. These are all realms that are becoming more difficult to achieve at the federal level. And then here too, just as with domestic policy making, the states with outsized stakes and economies, but those in energy, trade, and technology have special incentives to engage in foreign policy. In economic sectors that are underfunded or left unaddressed by Washington, larger states are seeking their own international partnerships or agreements to compensate. So in 2014, California began a cap-and-trade agreement with Quebec, allowing the two regions jointly to create the largest carbon market in North America. In 2022, the Massachusetts Biotechnology Council launched a partnership with the European Union Health Industry trade body to promote cross-border biotechnology research. Just a couple of weeks ago, the EU announced that it was opening a new office for technology policy making in San Francisco rather than in Washington. And when interviewed about it, they said, well, nothing gets done in Washington. And it's really Sacramento that matters to us. But I guess San Francisco's prettier, I'm not sure. Sacramento. So although the Constitution prevents states from entering into agreements that are legally binding, right, like they can't form treaties, the State Department has interpreted these constraints to apply only to agreements that have the enforcement of law, but that leaves plenty of room for states to make international agreements, generally in the form of an MOU. By other means. And California has been just super active on this. In fact, I just learned this week that when Gavin Newsom became governor, he had been lieutenant governor and had been kind of totally bored of the job. There was no responsibilities for him. And so he decided he was not going to do that to his lieutenant governor. And so when she came on board, and she was a former ambassador, maybe to the Honduras, I'm forgetting now. He put her in charge of international affairs for California. Next week, I'm attending a forum on Michigan and Iowa scientific partnerships with China, which is kind of interesting, even at a moment when officially the federal government is really pushing back against that. And just last month or so, the State Department announced a new position that they'd created, a special representative for subnational diplomacy, and appointed Nina Achigian, who is the former deputy mayor